Welcome to Dear Fans. Caitlin Clark is known for her humility and calmness, but one encounter at an airport would test her in ways she never expected. It was one of those days when Caitlin had just wrapped up a media tea. Despite being one of the biggest names in basketball, she tried to keep things low-key. When traveling, no entourage, no special treatment, just Caitlin, and her carry-on bag. This day was no different as she made her way to the boarding gate for her first-class flight to San Francisco. She had a quick appearance scheduled at a youth charity event the next day, something she was passionate about and never missed. When she could help it, at the gate, passengers were beginning to line up for boarding. Caitlin calmly joined the first-class line, her head pulled up and sunglasses on, hoping to avoid any unnecessary attention. Most people were focused on their phones or chatting quietly, but one woman in the line caught Hirish, was impeccably dressed, carrying an expensive designer bag, and seemed to be growing increasingly impatient. The airline attendant called for first class passengers to begin boarding, and Caitlin stepped forward. That's when the woman abruptly stopped her. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp and condescending. "This line is for first-class passengers only." Caitlin blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't even spoken a word, but the assumption in the woman's voice was crystal clear. She didn't think someone like Caitlin belonged there. The people around them shifted uncomfortably, but no one said a thing. For a moment, Caitlin considered brushing it off and letting the airline attendant handle it, but then she remembered all the times people like her parents had been judged unfairly. As a kid, her mom had always told her to stand up for herself and others, but to do it with class. She decided now was one of those moments. The attendant, clearly recognizing Caitlin, intervened quickly. "It's fine, ma'am. She's in first class." But the woman wasn't backing down. "Are you sure?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "I've seen people try to cut the line before." At that moment, you could feel the tension in the air. People were whispering now, some glancing at Caitlin, trying to figure out who she was. Still, Caitlin kept her composure, smiling slightly as she finally responded. "It's all right," she said. "I can wait my turn." Caitlin stepped aside, letting the woman board ahead of her. It wasn't worth making a scene, especially not in an airport where everything was already chaotic enough. But this wasn't the end of the story. The tension remained in the air as Caitlin Clark calmly stepped aside. To those watching, her response seemed almost too gracious considering the situation, but that's who Caitlin was, composed and thoughtful. Even when someone crossed a line, she wasn't one to make a scene, especially in a public setting. Still, her mind couldn't help but linger on the woman's assumption. It wasn't just about being questioned, it was about what her reaction as Caitlin boarded the plane. Moments later, she noticed the woman already settled in her seat, flipping through a magazine. The woman was seated in the row ahead of Caitlin's. Caitlin offered a polite smile to the flight attendants as she tucked her bag into the overhead compartment and settled into her seat. The cabin was quiet except for the hum of the engines and the occasional murmur of conversations. Caitlin put on her noise-canceling headphones, hoping to zone out for the next few hours, but fate had other plans. Minutes before takeoff, the woman flagged down a flight attendant. "Excuse me," she said loudly, her tone unmistakably annoyed. "Why is it so warm in here? Can you adjust the air conditioning?" The attendant nodded politely. "I'll check on that for you, ma'am." Caitlin glanced up briefly, noticing the growing discomfort among other passengers nearby. It wasn't unusual for people to make requests during a flight, but the woman's tone carried an air of an entitlement that was hard to ignore. Caitlin sighed inwardly, focusing on the playlist she prepared, yet she couldn't help but overhear snippets of the woman's continued complaints about the service, the seating, even the water not being cold enough. But the real turning point came mid-sleep. The attendants were serving meals, and Caitlin, being the easygoing person she was, thanked them warmly as they handed her tray. A simple interaction, but one that caught the attention of a young boy seated a few rows back. The boy's eyes widened as he recognized Caitlin and nudged his dad excitedly. "Dad, that's Caitlin Clark," the boy whispered, his voice filled with awe. Caitlin heard and smiled, giving the boy a small wave. The kid beamed, but his excitement also caught the attention of others, including the woman in the row ahead. She turned slightly, her eyes narrowing as she observed Caitlin more closely. She seemed to have recognized her, but quickly brushed it off, focusing instead on her. What happened next left her and everyone else as the flight attendant came back around to clear a tray. The young boy and his father approached Caitlin. The dad, clearly respectful, hesitated before speaking. "Miss Clark, I'm sorry to bother you. My son is a huge fan, and he couldn't stop talking about you. If it's not too much trouble, could we get a quick picture?" Caitlin removed her headphones, her smile genuine. "Of course," she said. "What's your Name Buddy. The boy, now grinning arrow ear, stammered, "It's Jason," while Jason, Caitlin said, "I'm glad to meet you, Lo, and get that picture." As they posed for the picture, the woman in the row ahead finally pieced it together, her face flushed, and she quickly averted her gaze, pretending to be engrossed in her magazine. Caitlin noticed her reaction out of the corner of her eye, but chose to ignore it. She was here for Jason and his dad, not to make a scene. The flight attendant, noticing the small drama, smiled and said, "Miss Clark, I hope you're enjoying the flight. Let us know if you need anything." Caitlin nodded politely. "Thank you, it's been great so far." But the woman couldn't take it anymore. She turned slightly, her voice hesitant now. "Excuse me, are you someone famous?" Caitlin glanced to her, her expression calm but unreadable. "I play basketball," she said simply. What Caitlin said was an understatement, but she didn't bother to explain further. The woman's face turned an even deeper shade of red as she realized her earlier assumptions had been completely wrong. This wasn't just any passenger. This was Caitlin Clark, one of the most recognized and respected athletes in the world, and she had dismissed her as someone who didn't belong in first class. What Caitlin did next, though, was what truly left an impression. She leaned back at her seat and returned to her music, acting as if nothing had happened. Her grace in handling the situation spoke louder than any confrontation could. As the plane began its descent, the woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She kept glancing back at Caitlin as if debating whether to apologize, but Caitlin didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she chose not to. When the plane landed, Caitlin stood up, helped a fellow passenger with their bag, and waited her turn to exit just like everyone else before she stepped off the plane. Though Jason and his dad approached her one last time. "Thank you, Miss Clark," the dad said sincerely. "You made our flight unforgettable." Caitlin smiled. "No problem, take care, you too." As she walked through the terminal, the woman followed behind, clearly still shaken. She didn't say a word, but the lesson was written all over her face. She had judged Caitlin unfairly, but Caitlin's actions had shown her what true character looked, and that perhaps was the best response of all. Caitlin made her way through the airport terminal with quiet confidence, trying to blend into the crowd. Despite being one of the most recognizable athletes in the country, she had a connecting flight to catch, and while the encounter with the entitled woman on the plane still lingered in her mind, she chose to let it go. As she entered the lounge area to wait for her next flight, Caitlin noticed Jason and his dad seated nearby. Jason's excitement hadn't faded. He was still clutching his phone and grinning. The sight warmed Caitlin's heart. Seeing how much joy something as simple as a photo could bring reminded her why humility and kindness were important even in situations where others might not show the same. Kin found a quiet corner to settle and ready to relax before boarding. But just as she began scrolling through her phone, a commotion suddenly broke out at the lounge entrance. She looked up to see the same woman from the plane in a heated argument with another passenger. Voices were raised, and heads turned to watch the unfolding scene. "She shoved right past me without even an apology," exclaimed an older man. "Well, maybe you shouldn't have been blocking the walkway," the woman shot back, her tone sharp and offensive. The argument got out of hand, and the lounge staff had to step in to calm things down. When the tension eventually dissipated, the awkwardness remained in the air. The woman, now visibly irritated, sat down at a nearby table, glaring at anyone who dared to look her way. Caitlin observed the scene from a distance, thinking not about the woman's behavior, but about how often people judged others without understanding their stories. The lounge gradually returned to its calm atmosphere. Meanwhile, Jason, still excited, approached a staff member to ask for a snack, with his dad following close behind. Kin smiled as she watched the pair interact. Moments like these, filled with innocence and joy, reminded her of her own journey and how important it was to make people feel seen. That an idea came to her, a small gesture that might make Jason's day even more special. Caitlin reached for her bag and pulled out her phone to type a quick message. A few minutes later, a member of her team arrived with a small package. Caitlin walked over to Jason and his dad, handing them the bag with a smile. "Ain't just a little something to say thanks for making the flight more enjoyable," she said warmly. Inside the bag was a pair of Caitlin's signature basketball sneakers, along with a few other signed items. Jason's eyes lit up as he pulled out the shoes, his excitement practically spilling over. "Thank you so much, Miss Clark," the boy exclaimed, his dad equally moved by the gesture. As they exchanged a few more words, the woman from earlier glanced over, clearly interested in the interaction. She hesitated for a moment before standing and walking toward them. Her expression was different now, softer, less defensive. "Excuse me," she began, her voice quieter than before. "I just wanted to say I didn't realize who you were earlier. I'm sorry if I came off as rude. Caitlin looked at her, her expression calm and thoughtful. After a brief pause, she nodded. It's okay, she said simply, her tone warm, yet sincere. The woman lingered for a moment, clearly unsure of what else to say. She glanced at Jason, who was now chatting enthusiastically with his dad, then back at Caitlin. That was really kind of you, she said, finally gesturing toward the gift. Caitlin shrugged lightly. It's the little things that count, she replied. The simplicity of her words seemed to strike a chord with the woman. She offered a small smile before returning to her seat. The woman noticeably softened after her brief exchange with Caitlin. For the first time that day, it seemed she was seeing Caitlin not as a random passenger or even as a celebrity, but as someone who genuinely cared about people. Soon the announcement for the next flight echoed through the lounge. Caitlin waved goodbye to Jason and his dad before grabbing her bag. As she walked toward the gate, she glanced back at the woman one last time. The woman met her gaze and gave her a small tentative smile, a gesture that carried a hint of acknowledgement and perhaps even gratitude. Caitlin smiled back before turning and heading toward her flight. She left the lounge with a light step and a full heart. For Caitlin, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about moments like these where kindness and grace could make all the difference. Little did Caitlin know what happened next would leave an even bigger impression. As Caitlin boarded her next flight, the events of the day played on her mind. From the entitled woman's initial reaction to Jason's pure excitement, it had been an emotional roller coaster, but for Caitlin it was all about staying true to herself. Kindness, humility, and gratitude were principles she carried everywhere she went. After landing at her destination, Caitlin stepped into the terminal prepared to move on with her, but as she scrolled through her phone, a notification caught her attention. A social media post had gone viral, video of her interaction with Jason in the lounge, including some parts of the earlier confrontation on the plane. A passenger had secretly filmed everything and shared it online, captioning the video, "Caitlin Clark proves why she's the GOAT." On and off the court, the post exploded with thousands of comments pouring in. Fans and strangers alike praised Caitlin for her calmness and generous spirit. The video had even captured the moment when the woman apologized, showing her change and attitude. The story quickly went viral, making headlines and trending across platforms. Caitlin smiled as she read the comments. She wasn't one to seek attention, but knowing that her actions had inspired others made it all worthwhile. One particular comment stood out: if more people acted like Caitlin, the world would be a better place. Kindness changes everything. The woman from the plane also saw the video. Watching herself through someone else's eyes was a humbling experience. She realized how her behavior had come across and how Caitlin had handled everything with grace. For the first time in a long time, she felt compelled to reflect on her actions. Inspired by Caitlin's example, she decided to make a change, starting with an anonymous donation to a children's charity in Caitlin's honor. Back at home, as Caitlin sat down to dinner, she shared the day's events with her family. They listened intently, proud of how she always found ways to spread positivity. In the end, Caitlin's actions didn't just impact those she encountered that day. They proved that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change lives, and that's a legacy far greater than any championship trophy. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.